Well, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for that slight delay. My name is Professor Michael Cox. I'm director of LSE IDEAS, which is LSE's foreign policy think tank and a research center here at the LSE dealing with foreign policy. It has been in business, so to speak, since 2008, and I hope will be in business for many, many more years to come. There's never more need for intelligent discussion about the world at the moment. The topic we are dealing with today with three of our great experts here, who I will welcome and introduce in a moment, couldn't be more important. It's really dealing with the whole question of China's relationship to the world in general, and whether or not China is moving inward. This often is talked about as becoming more autarkic, becoming more self-reliant, and whether this is a dynamic process which has been going on for some years, or whether this is something which is going to be accelerated by an increasingly problematic relationship between China and the United States, and indeed China and the rest of the world. And we've given this the rather provocative title, I hope anyway, of China in one country. The reason I gave it this particular title, for those who know their Soviet history, of course, is quite simple. Back in the 1920s, the Soviet Union formulated a new conception of its relationship to the world, which was called socialism in one country. The idea being that, of course, they had waited for world revolution and it hadn't happened. And now they had to rely upon themselves increasingly, hence the notion of building socialism in one country, whatever that kind of socialism was. Now, today, it's not about socialism, but possibly in an ideological context is very, very different since the end of the Cold War. We're not trying to make silly parallels, but whether or not, again, we are looking at a fundamental sea change, a shift in the relationship between China and the rest of the world, given that China itself has become integrated into the world economy. Globalization, in a way, has been a precondition for its own growth, and where this will lead the world, where this will lead China, and indeed the world economy. We have three speakers today who will go in the following order. I've got George Magnus, welcome George, from the Oxford China Center, who's written widely on China. Dr. Yu Jie, who used to be and is still affiliated here with LSE IDEAS, as indeed is George. And last but by no means least, Geoffrey Yu, who works for New York Mellon, and talk on some of the maybe the more specific economic aspects that I'm sure each of the three speakers will deal with that. I'm going to ask George to begin, speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. We'll move straight on to Dr. Yu Jie of Chatham House. And then last but by no means least, I said before, to Geoffrey Yu. So I will now leave, well, I'll stay, but remain chairing, and hand over to you, George, to take the conversation forward on China in one country. George, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mick. In fact, I was just thinking that actually somewhere in my dim and distant past associations with Trotskyism, I can also remember that Stalin, I think, was regarded once as a renegade turncoat on this particular topic of socialism in one country. And just by way of prep, I mean, a few sort of forays into New Left Review and Fifth International websites suggest he still is, and that even Xi Jinping's socialism with Chinese characteristics still ranks for many of whatever Trotskyists are still left out there as a questionable marriage of Leninism and markets, and a victory for capitalists and bureaucrats, as I read before. For most of us, though, I think Xi Jinping's China is, on the one hand, a vital market and competitor, and on the other, an autocratic and illiberal Leninist adversary. And Xi himself likes to talk about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, in which China moves not just center stage, but actually literally to the center of the world stage. He talks about socialism with Chinese characteristics as a path for other developing countries to follow. And he's set a goal for China to become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence by 2035. It's 15 years earlier than previous leaders had kind of indicated. In any event, this kind of rhetoric, I think, presupposes patterns of behavior and engagement in the global system that are actually quite the opposite of what you might think autarky is, or even the withdrawal suggested by other contemporary rhetoric, which revolves around this concept that Xi Jinping has articulated of self-reliance. So there seems to be a sort of a contradiction between China living up to Xi Jinping's ambition and turning its back on interdependence in favor of self-reliance. But I think often this contradiction may be more apparent than it is real. And I think both interdependence and self-reliance can be subsumed under what we might call globalization with Chinese characteristics, which is what I'd like to explore briefly. So globalization, as I think we all know, is in trouble. The United States, of course, is convulsed for the moment, at least, by division and unrest ahead of the presidential election campaign. But I think we mostly understand how the US system of government and business work. Many businesses are reluctant to cut their China ties and their exposure, notwithstanding what's going on. But the Trump administration speaks of, and obviously gives the nod sometimes, to decoupling. But businesses will not choose to change, in my view, unless they're forced to. Perhaps voters will, and we shall see. In China's case, though, I think a lot of this is much less well understood. So when Xi Jinping champions the cause of globalization, what does he actually mean? And when he refers to self-reliance, what does that actually imply? There's a lot of data that can show us how globalization is wilting, such as the volume of world trade and foreign direct investment, cross-border lending by financial institutions, and so on. And the so-called US-China trade war and rising protectionism, now the pandemic, are the latest phenomena to have now undermined the plumbing of globalization, which are supply chains, for reasons which are related to diversification of suppliers, and all the way on the other end of the spectrum to politics and national security. Not surprisingly, especially now, in the wake of the pandemic, China is also keen to keep foreign firms actually on side when it comes to manufacturing, technology, telecommunications, and financing, all of which have taken on a new significance in China. They were always significant, but especially significant because the government sees these as part of China's national security itself. So it's worrying, though, that globalization is fraying, but I think the most disconcerting bit about what's been happening in the last few years is the vacuum in leadership. The United States under President Trump has looked to abandon a role it's uniquely equipped to perform, while China, which is keen to be seen as a new leader, often looks like it lacks the ability to be one. Xi Jinping tries to prevent China in a leadership role to the acclaim of the world's elite in Davos in 2017, and again the following year at the Bao Forum in China. And yet, despite the rhetoric designed to make the global elite feel quite good about it, what China means by globalization is not quite the same as what the elite sometimes think they hear and understand. China's unquestionably been a huge, if not the major beneficiary of the world's open trading system. Its firms have been active in global M&A, and its banks are now the world's biggest by assets and have funded infrastructure across the Belt and Road universe. Yet for China, globalization remains very much a Western construct. A more assertive China would like to change the way it works, but it also wants to pursue self-reliance in key sectors, cutting its dependence on the United States especially, and entailing policies and goals that are in many ways the antithesis of globalization. So in its industrial policies, China has always wanted to catch up economically and build interdependence. The centrality of the Communist Party in the state to these endeavors has never been in doubt, and in fact is an essential part of the narrative in which the party takes credit for past, present, and future successes. Under Xi Jinping, this emphasis has become particularly pronounced. Indeed, the economic and operational management conditions facing private, including foreign firms in the last year or two, these are the backbone of employment and know-how, have not been as unfavorable for decades as I think they are currently. The strategy of indigenous innovation adopted in 2006 to favor the development of domestically generated innovation and technology frequently incurred the criticism of foreign companies claiming discrimination in things like competition policy, procurement, credit terms, technology transfer, and IP. Yet, in spite of recent proposals to strengthen intellectual property law and lift ownership caps in some sectors, this strategy has become enshrined in well, it's not new anymore, but it was in 2015, an initiative known as Made in China 2025, designed to create national champions with at least 70% self-sufficiency in 10 designated technological areas. Interestingly, the government stopped using the strategy by this name during the trade war, but there's no question that it remains a government priority, along with newer proposals in the same vein in artificial intelligence and now in semiconductors, especially in the light of China's vulnerability, or the vulnerability of Chinese technology companies such as Huawei and ZTE, as these have come to light in American policy. As you know, parties' economic, industrial, and foreign policy agendas have attracted a lot of criticism from foreign firms in recent years. But especially recently, I would say, less well known is the criticism emanating from Chinese scholars and intellectuals. Some have called into question the legitimacy of the government's narrative itself about China's success being attributable to the party, the state, and top-down industrial policy, and argued instead that the real reasons for China's success lie in attitudes and policies towards enterprise, markets, learning from other nations, and good governance. And with the government turning away from these, China is seen by these people as treading down a dangerous path. It's not always clear, but there's certainly almost a spectrum of opinion in China now, with some favoring continued interdependence, seen as the handmaiden of higher economic growth, diffusion of technology, acquisition of know-how, and leverage, and others fearful that China's vulnerability to and dependence on the United States and other nations, especially in, for example, some advanced technologies and components. My hunch, for what it's worth, is that China will, for now at least, continue to emphasize self-reliance in these areas, meaning higher levels of scientific and technological autonomy, reduced energy dependence, and a tilt away from exports towards domestic production. But it will also pursue a policy of globalization with Chinese characteristics, which is to say a system in which Chinese governance standards become more common, with a view ultimately to prevail, if that's the view in Beijing. Of course, it may not succeed or may only do so partially, but the rest of the world needs surely to take note, because China's pitch for acceptance of its decisions, governance, and regulations will take place in the context of its political ideas of control, stability maintenance, and if necessary, sanction, as the British government itself actually here may be about to discover. China's approach to global governance certainly often lacks the sort of alliance ethos and tolerance of dissent that we've traditionally associated with the global system since the end of World War II. When President Xi Jinping refers to globalization, he's certainly thinking, like all of us, about economic integration. But for him, it's not incompatible with self-reliance in these strategic sectors that I've mentioned and others deemed essential to national security. It's also part of what he calls a community with a shared future for humanity, which some have translated as common destiny for humanity, in which Chinese standards and norms hold sway. So in the end, and in conclusion, China's relative position vis-a-vis the United States, I think, when it comes to things like energy, high-end semiconductors, educational attainment, aging, high-end innovative science and engineering, and financial leverage, is not likely to improve much. Certainly not, I don't think, across the board. But simply sustaining economic growth and employment in the next year or two will be more than enough of a challenge. And many of the bonds of interdependence may prove quite difficult to rupture, except, of course, should they be overturned as a result of overt conflict. But at the very least, I think the horns have now been locked on a battle over global governance, And I think this is something that we need to understand much more about from a Chinese perspective in terms of its goals and features and flaws. Mick.
Thank you very much, George. That really opens up a whole series of questions, particularly that key one, which you stressed in terms of China stress on self-reliance, yet at the same time believing that it can still remain an important part of the world economy, interdependence, and those two are not in conflict. Now we're going to turn now to Dr. Yu Jie of Chatham House, who's written extensively over the last few years on China. We taught together at Peking University, so Yu Jie is a very, very well-known commentator. She's been writing very much on these kinds of issues and has a certain perspective, I think, and a voice, which I think we need to hear in that debate. So over to you, Cherry, over to you, Dr. Yu Jie.
Well, thank you so much, Mick. Delighted to return to LSE Ideas as always. And firstly, let me thank my colleague, and who perhaps you're not seeing on the screen, my colleague Gideon Guitar, and took over the High China foresight from me since I left LSE Ideas, and he has done a tremendous job, and I'd like to thank to him by taking this opportunity. Now, to answer your question, Mick, regarding the leadership and also regarding what kind of China we're going to experience in the years to come. I mean, you know my line always, and what I've been arguing in the past few months is, yes, perhaps there's a global leadership vacuum left by United States while United States is retreating. But was really sincerely China would like to fill that vacuum, would like to take the leadership button over from United States and back to Beijing. And perhaps it is not. I mean, I've been observing a sequences of meetings sent out by Politburo, and the conclusions I had so far, it seems to be that the Chinese leadership so far has given enough sufficient emphasis by focusing on domestic economic priorities and somehow try to revive a sluggish economy, but also how to generate employment, I mean the new employment, and also how to make sure those who live in a relatively economically bad condition and how they can really satisfy with their living standard. So what was really surprised me this year is for the first time since the last 35 years or so, and China did not produce a GDP number. This is perhaps not a surprise for many other economists, but certainly for political scientists, and this is something interesting to be observed. Now, my conclusion come to this is perhaps the GDP number is no longer be seen as a panacea to be able to surmount all the challenges facing by the Chinese Communist Party. So priority number one is how China and how the Chinese leadership is going to resolve the issue on the so-called income inequality among different segments of the population. And secondly, given the facing a collapse of the global demand, and given China is export-oriented economy, and how many jobs can actually China really create it? So the numbers they have calculated, and Chinese government has promised, is China is going to creating extra 9 million graduate jobs this year, and to make youngsters ends meet. I mean, perhaps if the youngsters are no longer occupied by any profession, and they might end up on the streets, like what happened in many parts of the world. So there's different ways and means for this current government to create jobs. And interestingly, China's government abandoned street vendors in the past 10 years or so. And now, since the convening of the two sessions, since the convening of National People's Congress, and the street vendors seem somehow welcomed back by the Chinese authorities. So street vendors would be a way of replacing and creating extra employments down the job market. And now another more acute issue, and which arises from Premier Li Keqiang's conversation with a journalist last week. And he made the suggestion that China still had 600 million population, still with a monthly income of less than $140 a month. So perhaps that number is just quite staggering. But imagine China by being a global economic powerhouse on the one hand, whereas on the other hand, they still have 40% of the population still live in a relatively modest economic standard. Now, how the party is going to reconcile that economic inequality between the richer and the poor, perhaps is the major challenge beyond any of the GDP target numbers whatsoever. Now, so if we're talking about income inequality, it is not just about income inequality, but it's also about inequality in terms of a lack of access in different social welfares and in different education. So for example, for those who live in the rural area and for those who live in inland provinces of China, the chance for getting into a top quality secondary education are much lower than those who live in the first tier cities and live in the coastal provinces. And then because of that secondary education resources being unevenly distributed, and therefore this directly impact job perspectives and also the prospects and influence for those people to be able to get a higher quality higher education in the top tier cities. So again, it's that sense of inequality, and especially for those who have, and in particularly for those who have not and have not benefited from the last 40 years of economic reform, and somehow these are the group of population and Xi Jinping would really have to look after in years to come. I mean, I'm noticing George's comments, George was suggested perhaps, you know, scholars and the certain urban elites criticize about Xi Jinping and criticize this legitimacy issues of the Communist Party. But from what I've realized so far, I think the core supporters from presidency, it is not scholars, it is not urban dwellers. It is certainly for those people from lower to medium level income groups. And these people, perhaps presidency will have to make sure they would improve their reasonable living standard. So to go forward, there are different voices within China. There's a different vested interest groups within China. And the priority now for presidency and for his team is to prevent a perception of failure of managing the economy. And therefore that perception of failure has to be prevented from the lower to middle level income group people. So that's just a domestic scenario, the challenge China is facing. Now, come to the foreign affairs. George somehow suggested this whole narrative regarding China and the global governance. What kind of model of global governance China would like to propose, or what kind of so-called China-centered international order perhaps China will put forward to? I think the three key elements in here and what we have seen so far. The first element is a development model based on economic assistance, based on economic developments by using the Belt and Road Initiative as a vehicle to achieve such ends. So the BRI is not end by itself, but BRI, it is a vehicle to achieve that end of so-called economic governance model China proposed. But very carefully, in terms of the ideology, China does not really demand a firm ideological commitment from those recipient countries or from those countries who like to collaborate within China, within the BRI. So instead, much of the focus has been given on the economic side of the story. So the elements of the ideology, this element of China narrative doesn't exist as strongly as many of the other Western commentators be made. Now, the second element in here is that sense of technology advancement, technology system that China would like to establish. It is not just about technology itself. It is not just about debate on what kind of AI or how advanced the AI technology could be applied in the Belt and Road Initiative, but instead, it is that sense of the technology standard that China intends to establish within the international system. And that technology standard would be largely in line with what Xi Jinping has put forward to, that whole notion of the so-called discursive power. So this discursive power means China will be able to shape the international debate from the very beginning of that debate. So instead of being an agenda follower, but China would prefer to become agenda setter. So that's the second element within that so-called China's ways of a global governance. Now, the third one, perhaps in here will be added, is that in terms of introducing greening agenda. So including more green element within the Belt and Road Initiative, more green element within the economic global governance China being put forward to. But how far China could go, at the moment, it is still in very much a nascent stage, I can see. Now, I think the central challenge for China to go forward, there are two things on foreign affairs. And firstly, Chinese leadership will have to learn how to respond to transnational concerns and to work together with countries that are ideologically different from China. So that would be the challenge for current and also for the future of the Chinese leadership. Now, the second challenge, it is on the perception. So many of those initiatives being put forward by the Chinese, and perhaps we have heard, Belt and Road, the shared community of mankind, all those kind of initiatives or ideas. It is fine by utilizing China's resources, by utilizing China's political willingness, but it largely also depends on the perception that China created to the rest of the world, and also how the rest of the world will act on that perception. So these are the two key challenges, and China will have to dealt with to go forward for international affairs, irrespective if China would like to take the leadership role or not to take that leadership role. But can China really surmount for all those domestic and foreign affairs challenges? And it seems to be a very hard sell, but nobody knows. 50 years ago, the country was right in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, and who could have seen China one day become an innovative economic power, and whose market and influence has one day really changed the world. So I ended in here just to give you some of my observations on domestic and foreign affairs situations inside China and where the country is heading on, and look forward to many of the disagreements and comments from the audience.
Thanks very much, Cherry. I think, your emphasis really, as I heard you speaking there, was really look at the domestic side as much before you start thinking about what China's doing in the world, which we tend to do outside of China, inevitably so. And you stress the whole questions of the social problems China still faces in the interior, rural areas, levels of inequality, degrees of poverty. I'd never heard those figures before for 600 million people. That's really quite remarkable. Also, the simple problem of getting people jobs and making sure the job market remains buoyant. That might be, as you seem to be implying, a far greater priority for China than what it does externally. What it does externally is going to be conditioned by those limits. And I think it's important to bring us to those limits, because so much, I think, of Western commentary has been talking about China taking the world over rather than focusing on the huge constraints China faces in the world. And be interested to hear you and George maybe having a short conversation on that, whether there's big disagreements there or just small ones, or none at all. We shall wait and see. Okay, finally, we're moving over to our good friend Geoffrey Yu down in Sevenoaks. Geoffrey, we look forward to what you have to say. Geoffrey, over to you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. So I'll just talk about the financial elements of this, especially the questions about will deglobalization and decoupling lead to financial decoupling, and how all of this matches up in terms of China's financial reforms. So as we know, when it comes to global finances and capital flows, all of this works both ways, in and out. So for the most part of the last 20, 30 years and beyond, China has been far more welcoming to inbound investment to help with its development, since the earliest days of joint ventures with largely money from the diaspora, including from Hong Kong and Taiwan, to the joint ventures, which still happen, say, between the car companies right now, but all of that has actually evolved into more diversified styles of investment, including portfolio investment. There's growing interest in Chinese equities and bond markets. The renminbi has liberalized to some extent as well, and that is going to be an ongoing process. At the same time, allowing money to flow in the opposite direction, that has been more of a stop-start situation. One of the most important aspects of financial stability, which the Chinese central bank and the Chinese government always looks at, of course, is capital flight, right? This is an issue that does plague emerging markets. It's done so, throughout the last few decades, and China doesn't want to run into a situation where it is struggling to manage the outflows. China's financial system is perhaps uniquely dependent on ample liquidity. Much of it is supplied through its healthy surpluses, which translates into onshore liquidity, and that is a mechanism which is tightly managed by the central banks and other authorities. So where do we stand right now? Suffice to say, China has made big efforts to court overseas investment over the last few years or so, and despite a difficult geopolitical backdrop, this is continuing. The central bank, Ministry of Finance, they have called upon onshore players to diversify their forms of funding and financing away from loans by local banks or state banks, more towards equity issuance. And of course, international investment is going to be a big part of that. A few years ago, when the Shanghai Hong Kong Stock Connect was launched, for example, that has led to a massive increase into inflows. And with more recent developments, such as MSCI index inclusion and inclusion in the bond indices, this has precipitated a further improvement. We are seeing it in the data, and I think this is a development which China, by and large, will welcome. Of course, it's regulated, and companies will also be mindful of the demands upon foreign investors, but generally, this is believed to be healthy for overall development of Chinese companies and governance. Having said that, does this mean that China is going to be willing to allow this sort of inbound investment to assume controlling stakes or very, very large, significant and influential stakes in Chinese companies? That I think remains to be seen. When people complain about a level playing field between China and the rest of the world, I think that this is something that is often brought up in international relations, and Dr. Yu, of course, can speak a bit more about that. So this is going to be a gradual process, and I think in part there are wider institutional considerations, but at the same time, I think it's widely acknowledged that not just in China, but in Asia, for example, there is somewhat of a reluctance, to allow broad, foreign control of, not just public assets such as bonds, but also private assets. And for example, Japanese domestic investors own about 92% of outstanding Japanese government debt, and if you look at Japan's overall debt ratios, Greece sometimes compares favorably to that on a gross basis, but it's totally under control, right? Because if you actually have total onshore control of your debt situation, then that can actually limit the ability of foreign creditors to push for changes in governance and also fiscal reforms. But taking that aside, I think the overall trend of increased foreign investment and increased weightings on an asset allocation basis by foreign institutional private investors, that is only going to rise. And the only reason is, China, even though growth is facing many, many headwinds, it is still going to probably outpace much of the rest of the world, especially developed markets. China abandoned its growth target this year, which is widely within expectations. Even if we come through with a number of, say, between 2 to 4%, that is still outpacing what we're seeing in the developed world. And I think that's reflected in part by Chinese bond yields as well, which in part reflects growth prospects currently between the 2 to 3%, depending on the maturities. Whereas if you look at the US, if you look at everyone where else, we're looking at bond yields hovering at around 0 or 0 to 50 basis points, that kind of a level, and yet there's still record bids for that. So just on an asset allocation basis, this search for yield, which is necessary for insurance funds and pension funds, those flows are only going to continue over time. But again, the question is, whether they can actually influence or help, change behavior or governance. I think that's going to be a separate debate, right? How about flows out of China? This has probably become a bit more controversial over the last few years, and I think it's important to distinguish two types of flows. First is just private sector asset allocation rebalancing flows, and this I mean by Chinese households in general. We all know they are heavy savers. In the past, it's really always been a question of real estate in their investment prospects and their asset allocation. Chinese equity markets, there is a lot of domestic participation, but for your average household and for the larger savings pools, that is probably not a major part of their holdings. So as with any investor class, when you start to diversify your asset allocation away from core holdings, and in China's case, in Chinese households' case, that core holding is a renminbi denominated real estate asset. Of course, you are going to see more and more, different types of investments, a significant part of which will be foreign investments, be it direct investment overseas, such as, purchasing real estate, or portfolio investments, such as the ability through investment vehicles to purchase overseas instruments and bonds and equities. This has been rising as well under the auspices, largely of China's monetary authorities and the state's foreign exchange regulator, of course. Another major source of outflow that we've seen over the last few years, and this is where political chime comes in, is on the part of corporates, right? We've also seen major acquisitions by Chinese enterprises, some privately owned, some state-owned, they've been able to tap financing, again, some from private sources, some from state sources, and where reserves are being used to help these corporates leverage up and purchase overseas stakes, purchase stakes in strategic overseas assets. That has been a rising trend as well. And suffice to say, not all of the flow has, benefited stability in the exchange rate. Not all of the flow, has, generated positive returns even. I think it's well publicized right now that debt forgiveness is high on the agenda between China and countries which have benefited from Chinese flows over the last few years, be it Belt and Road projects and otherwise. So this has not only led to a major downdraft in China's reserve holdings, but it also has led to geopolitical issues as well. And we are going to see greater scrutiny of Chinese official outbound investment over time, especially in some sensitive industries, such as tech and national infrastructure and otherwise. George touched upon this as well. So I think in terms of deglobalization and financial decoupling, this is one area where we will see more scrutiny ahead, and some of the flows the pace of it will slow down, and should this result in a tightening in financial conditions, then this will have implications for the global economy as well. As we know, probably multilateral lenders or private sector sources from the West, perhaps they're not exactly in a position to help out at this stage. One final aspect, I guess, is, and what people often ask, where does this leave the renminbi on a short-term basis, and also for China's prospects to turn the renminbi into an internationalized currency and a reserve currency? One thing is clear. Renminbi is going to have a greater weighting in reserve pools, and we are seeing that already in the IMF composition of foreign exchange reserves data. It's gone from practically 0 to low to mid single digits, but over the medium to longer term, I think what needs to be realized is that the dollar's dominant position is going to be hard to dislodge. If you see one of the biggest contributions the Federal Reserve made in recent months, when we saw a lot of volatility in markets, was the ability for foreign central banks to obtain dollar liquidity indirectly from the Fed by not selling their treasury holdings, their US treasury holdings. So this is using a US government asset to obtain short-term dollar cash with a US central bank. And many reserve managers participated in this because there was a scramble for dollars. We didn't read about a scramble for renminbi or otherwise, so it just shows the dollar's dominance right now. But to cut a long story short, so the dollar became the world's main source of financing to cater to the US consumer, right? So this was an organic development, over many decades, from the setup of the Bretton Woods institutions from the end of the Second World War. And it's my personal view that Chinese consumers need to see their demand pick up, ease savings, fill the investment gap, and also China needs to start running current account deficits for renminbi to organically become a reserve currency. And given consumer preferences right now within China, we're just not seeing that for the time being. And this year, if anything, China's services deficit is going to fall sharply, because you're not seeing the outbound tourism, you're not seeing outbound travel into universities and paying tuition fees. So that is actually helping China's balance of payments right now, but in my view also undermines China's case to make the renminbi a reserve currency, because suddenly the Chinese consumer, especially for services rather than goods, is actually nowhere to be seen. So that's something we need to take into account. But the renminbi has internationalized. We are seeing more trading, 24-hour sessions, 5 days a week, and this trend is only going to continue. There will, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the greater asset allocation flow, the greater weightings of Chinese assets in global investment portfolios, renminbi demand will rise. But to go from that to becoming a reserve asset to China challenging the US, I think that will take it will take a long time and require the changes, as I mentioned, in Chinese household behavior, but also whether it's desirable, or not, that remains to be seen. The Fed often has to expand its balance sheet. So the US central bank has to expand its balance sheet to provide liquidity for the rest of the world. And that actually creates issues, for the US itself politically. But on the other hand, I think there will be greater demand, over time. It's just in managing the process. But will this also mean that Chinese households will be able to freely convert, their onshore currency, into overseas assets will it again address the imbalances or the asymmetry in China's capital accounts and its overall foreign exchange regime right now? I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think that there is any conflict between renminbi liberalization and internationalization, with other developments right now, because they are on the political side, they are going through separate tracks. One final point I would make is you are seeing, especially in recent days and weeks, a rash of secondary listings in Hong Kong by Chinese companies who are already listed in the US and other areas. So just looking for a new place to access some international capital in the same time zones as their own economies. But of course, there are geopolitical considerations there as well. That actually is probably, it may look controversial on a headline level, but I don't think it's something that Beijing would actually not welcome, because it brings them closer to home, and it's a regulatory regime, a supervisory regime, which they're actually more familiar with, or they may actually be able to influence. So whether this is the right way for the US and the senators to actually go about this is worth considering as well. Right. So quite a few topics there. I'll leave it at that and hand it back to Mick.
A very detailed and comprehensive survey of some of the major economic issues and financial questions. I mean, what I took from you, if I could just generalize, I mean, there's so much detail, there's such great detail, and it's great to have your expertise on this, is you're quite optimistic about the long-term prospects for the Chinese economy. I think that's what it came out to me, as I understood it. But nonetheless, the dollar still remains dominant within the international financial system. We can pick up on some of those things, whether they're much, again, going back to what Cherry said, much of the exaggeration about China's rise, it still forgets the prevalence of the dollar as the universal currency, not even to go into the questions of the military balance between the US and China. Anyway, not enough, too much from me already. I've got a lot of questions. First, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for not mentioning COVID-19. But I'm bound to throw it into the mix, how you feel COVID-19 has impacted on the question itself. Has that transformed it? Has that taken it to a new level? Has it made the potentiality for conflict between the US and China more likely, which seems obvious? Does it actually accelerate the dangers of not deglobalization, but a new form of it? Why don't we just pick that question up quickly, George, move on then to Cherry and then on to you. It's the COVID question. I had to ask it because, in a sense, that's what we're all talking about at the moment. George, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not sure I can say anything that isn't kind of immediately self-evident to everybody, which is, that China, found itself in, a bit of a very, very sort of tricky, criticized situation early in the year. Then, as the pandemic rolled around the world and we found ourselves, certainly no better, and in often case, much worse able to cope at a time when China, which is about 8 weeks ahead of us in the whole kind of pandemic evolution, sort of got to the point where it was able to lift its lockdown and production started to ramp up again. So the balance sort of shifted. China tried to sort of seize the initiative to change the narrative. And now it's not clear that initiative has really succeeded, just because I think they've handled it in a very kind of clumsy fashion. But I think the bottom line really is it certainly has made everybody, I think, a little bit more nationalistic about everything from, control over supply chains, particularly in pharmaceuticals and medical supplies and so on, to, just being more tetchy about, about themselves, about kind of exposure to, foreign influences. And I think it's thoroughly unsavory and unhelpful all round, actually. But it is a reality that it's unfortunately something that pandemics have done historically. Yeah,
okay. Cherry, have you got a quick thought on that one then, Geoffrey, quickly?
Yeah, sure. Yes, accelerate for sure. I mean, I just feel like many of those things we have discussed in here is very much a sense of deja vu. Many things we're talking about self-reliance, and we're talking about income equality. Such a things really largely exist well before COVID-19. It's just because of this pandemic have somehow exacerbate all of this, and therefore China have to come up with some kind of plan and dealt with it. I mean, one of the conclusions perhaps Xi Jinping and his team had was after 18 months bruising a trade war with the United States, and Chinese economy is still holding reasonably well, I mean, reasonably stable, and therefore they felt somehow they can afford to be a little bit more self-reliant. It can afford to be a little bit more serving its own domestic interest. I think become self-reliant, it does not necessarily only apply to China, but also largely apply to many other parts of the world. Now, we'll come back to the question on, you know, poverty elevation, on all of that domestic challenges I spoke earlier. And I think it's because of this pandemic make the whole thing become more acute with more anxieties among the Chinese population. And therefore, I think the leadership took every crisis with an opportunity. If they have vowed to eradicate absolute poverty by the end of the year, and perhaps this crisis provided an opportunity to fulfill that promise.
I also remember a conversation we had, Chair. I mean, also the question is not what China did or did not do, and when it did it or when it did not do it, is also, I suppose, there's always the comparison with the United States. And I suppose, to be perfectly honest, without turning this into another critique of President Trump.
Well, it's the
but I mean, you know, the
issue.
contrast does seem, for me anyway, personally, at least speaking personally, rather sharp. Anyway, Geoffrey, why don't you come in on that, please?
Well, I'm actually, so two sides there. One is probably it could have, you know, accelerated some of the market trends that we already saw last year. You know, Cherry already mentioned the deglobalization issue and trade war. You know, that certainly had an impact on markets last year, and we're just going to see a continuation of that. But it's much more restricted. It's not deglobalization or trade war causing a broader sell-off. It's only the companies which may actually suffer from a P&L point of view or from supply chain point of view. They will still be affected. But actually, if we flip this and just compare responses, not just China, but the perception that Asia has actually managed COVID a bit more competently than the rest, I'd say they've actually benefited from the rebalancing flows, and we're especially seeing it in bond markets and equity markets.
No, that's very interesting to put it in the wider regional context. It's not just a question of China and America. It's the question of Asia more generally and how it's dealt with COVID, which does look a good deal more professional than we have seen in the UK or the USA. Now, I've got a number of questions which have come up, several. I'll start with the first question from David Manning, an old friend of LSE Ideas. So David Manning, to David, it's a question to Cherry, but to maybe others want to pick up on it. It's the question that David asks, Cherry, about the figure of 600 million now in poverty. Is that a new figure? Have you heard that figure before? It seems a new figure to me, maybe to David as well. And secondly, does this have some political implications? And why now the release of that figure? Or should we not read too much into it? Cherry, maybe you could pick up on that, please. Thanks.
Well, I don't think it's a new figure at all. It's just a more realistic assessment regarding the capability of China, especially the economic capability of China. And that's one thing. So if we're talking about the kind of consensus within the party, I mean, there's always some different disagreement within the party on how should we run the economy, how should we, put forward domestic priority. I mean, if there's one priority with all the consensus among all senior party members would be the poverty elevation, would be eradicate absolute poverty, but also to improve the reasonable living standard of what I've called it middle to lower income groups of those 600 million. You would see more and more policy outcomes and policy results from the upcoming 14th five-year plan. You will see much less investment will be on infrastructure, on hard infrastructure, but much of the focus will be refocusing back to social welfare, refocusing back on medical cares, and refocusing back on personal well-being to make each household felt themselves would be that part of the story of economic success. Because so far what we have in the past few years for China is you have letting the part of the people get rich first. I mean, that's what Deng Xiaoping said several years ago. But while letting the part of the people get rich first, but you still have a majority who's still living in a rather difficult situation. And I think those who are the underprivileged people, and somehow Xi Jinping will have tried to satisfy. Because if we're talking about legitimacy, that runs to the heart of the legitimacy question.
And that also links to, David, also part of that question on inequality itself. Does that pose a question for legitimacy as well? Or can China handle that one as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the inequality question, I think this would apply for any government, for any political regime. I mean, we can all agree, irrespective which political system we are, is the accountability between the governed and the governor that matters. Now, the accountability for China and for the Chinese government is we'll have to make sure the economy could work reasonably, to make sure everybody has a bit of the pie, if I may say so. I mean, good news perhaps for the Chinese pensioners as well. They have a pay rise this year, which is, you'll be surprising. This perhaps is unique to the world.
It's interesting, yeah. And of course, as you emphasize, it is a generalized phenomenon. The left behinds are now being talked about much more than they were before, even in this country as well, you know, from the rhetoric coming from the Prime Minister. I got another question here, maybe for you to pick up on, George. If you want to pick up on anything else, you, Geoffrey, as well, feel free. It's a question from Colm Coakley, I think, sorry. Ask the question, is there a fundamental contradiction between having a great firewall, we know what we're talking about here, and at the same time China being a member of the international community? George, why don't you pick up on that one? Is there a basic contradiction, or can China, as it manages to do lots of other times and lots of other issues, manage to handle that one effectively or not? That's the question coming. George, you want to go on that one?
Yeah, very interesting question. I'd just like to kind of follow up on the last one, if I may. Just two short, but I think quite interesting observations. I mean, the first is, although Premier Li, you know, made a big play of this thing, about 600 million people on $140 and so on. Actually, there was a bit of a kind of a brouhaha about it. I mean, it was refuted by the National Bureau of Statistics and by other professors at various Chinese universities. But if that's true, and of course, as Cherry just kind of indicated, I mean, it's not new, and we know that there is substance in the observation that Premier Li was making. What does that say about China in the 2020s as the dynamic that it faces externally and internally becomes much, much tougher? So, you know, it begs a lot of questions about, we've spoken a little bit about income inequality and wealth inequality, also about social security. I mean, there is general coverage, obviously, of pensions and healthcare and so on, not always and of course not for migrant workers, but the generosity levels and the benefit levels on retirement and for people who need healthcare and so on are not great. And so given that, you know, approximately half the population, or just under half the population, clearly are still in a very, very difficult economic position, and we have a very immature social security system, really. I mean, my view is that China will be, you know, fully preoccupied during the next 10 years, sorting out or attending to domestic issues, and I think that has a bearing on its international behavior as well. But on the question of the contradiction, I think it's certainly one very good example of how conflicted China is. I mean, many people may know that actually this year, China tried to kind of pitch itself for the presidency or the leadership of the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is kind of like, really? Bearing in mind censorship and firewall and so on and so forth. And in the end, the job, as I understand it, went to a Singaporean once the Americans had kind of intervened. But there are lots of examples of this where China has kind of pitched or is pitching for its standards and beliefs or values to be represented in United Nations organizations, to do with internet standards, to do with hardware and software standards. WIPO was another example. Human rights on the United Nations Commission for Human Rights is another one. So there are these tensions kind of keep cropping up, which I think the world is obviously going to have to deal with and kind of address in some way, which is, you know, here we have, you know, a very large, very potentially very powerful, very influential, second biggest economy in the world, et cetera, pitching a kind of its governance standards to global institutions, but actually not everybody can find themselves falling in line with those standards in the way that I'm sure that, you know, Beijing would normally like. So it's a big problem. You know, we'll have to see how we do actually eventually resolve these things.
Okay, well, we can, if others want to follow up on that, I think one can. Here's a question to all of you. Maybe Cherry first to pick up on this one, because I know you've done a lot of work on the question of thinking about not just China and the leadership as a homogenous bloc, but as something which actually could be quite divided against itself with different perspectives and different outlooks. And whether, you know, this also raises the whole question of whether the president himself has a complete consensus around him of everybody agreeing with him. So it raises that question of a complexity of decision making, and this is a question that's come from one of our listeners and viewers about those divisions inside China, and how serious are they, or are they being exaggerated by Western commentary? Cherry, do you want to pick up on that one first, and maybe others?
Sure. I think what we should try to understand in here, we should avoid to think about this is only about faction politics. Fine, faction politics does exist, but what's more important is we have to bear in mind this is the governing party, that governing country. They only have to do it in order to have the successful delivery. They cannot afford to fail. And therefore, everyone has some kind of interest to make sure the system works better. So all these years, what party is trying to do is to make sure the system could work for perhaps most of the vested interest groups within the society. So you have different voices within the society. I think at the end of the day, the Communist Party almost become that somehow holding the largest, lowest common denominator to make sure everyone has a little bit share of the pie, and in order to make sure the system could work. I mean, it is incredibly complex and fragmented system to some extent. And also, it is not always top-down approach. There's also a bottom-up approach as well. So I don't think we should really just conclude that everything can be decided and will be decided just by one particular person. And we should look into this case by cases. And most likely, economic policy planning, it is in hands of economists.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier on the whole Soviet debates of the 1920s around socialism in one country, which George picked up on very wittily, if I might say so, George. You know, following the death of Stalin in 1953, of course, there was a move to enter collective leadership. Now, it's not the same kind. Should we actually speak more of a collective leadership in China? Much of the emphasis in the debate about China is focused on the president and his increasing concentration of powers in his own hands. Should we be more talking, as you seem to be implying, Cherry, of a greater degree of collective leadership, or at least collective construction of some kind of consensus?
Again, I mean, we should look into different policy aspects. I mean, clearly, I mean, one of the examples I can give is before the National People's Congress started, I mean, there was a variety of debate whether China should have a GDP number this year, and also what kind of stimulus that China could offer. So that kind of debate has already been quite exorbitant within the domestic debate, and perhaps that's not been really covered by West media as such at all. So different opinions do exist, but really depends on which policy areas you look into. So it's not just a black and white, and therefore the party dictate the market, and the market have to follow party. That is not the case for China.
There's also, Geoffrey, I want to bring you in here on the economic debates going on inside China, which I know you follow. Can one see various clear demarcation lines between different perspectives in China amongst certain economists, some favoring state-owned enterprises, some more favoring the market? Is there a real vibrant debate going on inside China amongst the economists who have an influence over the leadership?
I think there was, but you know, right now that's kind of, you know, taking a back seat, right? It's you know, everywhere else is whatever it takes, and let's be frank, we're getting every other day, you know, headlines of nationalization or stakes into airlines, for example, by European governments. So I don't think anywhere right now that we are seeing a lot of state support. I think we can even say that for the UK, right? So is there going to be a selection of national champions, you know, which from a strategic is going to survive? One area where there was, let's just say, some division is to reflate the economy. How is that going to happen? Is it going to be through debt? Is it going to be through opening the floodgates through to reform and allow private money to actually flow back into markets, or are they just not going to go for it and not give up the gains from the deleveraging campaign from a few years ago? And to my surprise, actually, the technocrats seem to actually have retained the front foot, because even the Ministry of Finance, which you know, traditionally has try to lean a bit more on the central bank to open the liquidity taps. They recently have come out and said need to avoid debt risks as well. So I think it's a testament to the policy making right now, that the lessons of 2009, when there was just a mass loan binge and the issues it created for the next decade or so, that lesson for now has been learned. But if some of the poverty issues, the unemployment issues that Cherry talked about for new graduates and for those who are displaced right now, if that really does come back to bite social stability, we still cannot, let's say, rule out, okay, go and build cities, go and build houses as long as people have a job. That really cannot be ruled out at this point. But so far, I think the sensible option, which is a mix of liquidity and also state support, through wider budget deficits, which, to be frank, again, we're seeing everywhere in the world right now, that argument seems to be on top.
That's interesting. Thanks very much. And the parallels too, particularly with the Conservative government in this country. Has it gone Chinese? It's an interesting discuss. We've got a question here from Jonathan Femby, who you all know, well-known writer on Chinese affairs, history of China, the Penguin history. Hello, Jonathan. And it's also another question from another friend, Mohammed, asking, broadly speaking, for any of you to reflect on China's relationship with its own region, with East Asia. What's happening there? How is not just COVID impacting on that, but more generally, how do you read that, particularly not just in relationship to the obvious suspects like Japan or Taiwan, but also Indonesia as well? Where are we in that? Because I'm personally, I'm not sure I've been hearing quite a great deal about this over the last, because so much has been focused on the US-China. Have we taken our eyes off this, what's going on inside East Asia? George, do you want to kick off on that one, on the East Asia question, what's broadly speaking happening there?
I was going to duck it over to Chatham House, but actually, Jerry, but it seems to be the right place. But I mean, my own feeling about this, without sort of getting into any of the sort of nitty gritty, is I think the situation for a lot of Asia, East Asia in particular, is this sort of conflict that I think countries are, finding continuously now, which is really that their economic security, lies in China's fate and prospects. And for many of them, the political security is elsewhere, i.e. still with the United States that they're not sure they really recognize anymore, but, by default, it still happens to be that. And I think it's just a very, I don't really know how we eventually get around to resolving this, and maybe we can't really say anything greatly coherent about it until after November. But that I think is the problem. I mean, we've seen this through the pandemic as well, actually. Same sort of things sort of cropping up about this sort of schism really between, where they look for economic and where they look for political security. I think in Japan's case, it's kind of quite interesting in particular, because obviously not best of friends traditionally, but there sometimes has been a bit of a meeting of minds between Abe and Xi Jinping. And yet, interestingly, Li Keqiang basically said something the other day, was quoted as saying something the other day about it didn't really come out in favor of the TPP successor, in which Japan plays a big role, but it wasn't a completely unfriendly series of comments about looking at the organization at some point through Chinese eyes. But the Japanese were a little bit kind of sniffy about it. So I do think this kind of political division is really something which is going to be quite difficult to overcome, really.
Okay, the contradiction between security coming from the United States and economic prosperity ultimately dependent on China continuing to be economically prosperous. Cherry, do you want to pick up on that one?
Sure. I mean, that difficulties, that way of squaring the circle seems to apply for many of the medium-ranged countries. I mean, not just in East Asia, even including countries like UK, will have to face that choice ultimately. Now, come back to the answers on China and its relation with the East Asia region. I think that's, again, for me, it's almost like China has, after all these years of running the so-called the great power diplomacy with the United States, with European Union, and finally judging by the meeting result from National People's Congress, it seems to be that China decided to return to its own periphery diplomacy. So how to stabilize the relationship with its own neighbors? I mean, as we know, China is sharing borders with 17 different neighbors, different countries. So that become quite pertinent for China to run a successful periphery diplomacy on the one hand. And the way how China conducted, by using economic statecraft. So by using China's enormous economic resources to extend that political influence. So we can see that from the Belt and Road Initiative. So if we're going to give priorities for the BRI in the next 5 years or so, and I would say really the priorities will be around East Asian economies, because I mean, they are well developed, and then this sense of connectivity and infrastructures are well built over there. Now, secondly, one economic pact proposed by China is the RCEP. Is the world trade agreements made by mostly developing countries. So again, you see East Asian economies are integrated into that way of the perhaps even the Chinese way of economic governance. But whether East Asian economies are willing to be tied with the network of those with China, and the questions we don't really know. But at the end of the day, perhaps there would be economic reality that will tell the truth. And also, if we're talking about supply chain, if we are talking about industrial repatriation, if we're talking about transfer of shifting supply chain away from China, then again, the East Asian economy become quite important elements over there. Because I mean, the labor cost in China increasing anyway. That's already happened right before COVID-19. So how Asian economy perhaps could be benefit from perhaps China move up the value chain as well. So I think to go forward, the economic side of the story is much easier to answer than the political side of the story. I mean, I agree with George. Let's wait and see what happened in November, because if we are going to have a Biden presidency, and then perhaps Biden would utilize the alliances, especially the Asia-Pacific alliances, far more than Donald Trump.
Do you think we could, either you, George, or even Geoffrey, can we now talk of Asia as a regional economy? Because I know Parag Khanna and a number of others who've written about this, really making the big emphasis on almost an Asia regionalism now, of which China is but one player within that. And are we going to move towards regionalization anywhere, away from the sort of hyper-globalization? Do you think that applies to Asia? The degree of integration now seems to have gone a very, very long way, does it not? Sherry, do you want to pick that up quickly? Maybe bring in Geoffrey on that one too, if you don't mind. Oh, so, did you hear me then, Sherry?
Sorry, I saw you direct to Geoffrey. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
Just quickly, then bring in Geoffrey.
I mean, East Asian economy, of course we can, but I mean, East Asia cover quite a wide range of regions. So you have advanced economies like Singapore, which is almost like a developed countries anyway. Then you also have countries like Laos. So that sense of different development stage, I mean, I'm not sure how this region could be integrated. I mean, that's what we were talking about before. Back 2 years ago, we were talking about the flying geese model. That was perhaps the golden age of that low-cost manufacturing, and therefore enabled the so-called four dragons of Asia to kick it off. But we're not in that stage anymore. Yeah. So I would say great diversification.
Yeah. Also, Vietnam's an interesting case study too in its own right. Geoffrey, do you want to come in on that, on East Asian regionalism very briefly?
I would largely agree with that. I think Vietnam, as you mentioned, has been mentioned by many, and as potentially a substitute, for the low value add or medium value add industries that China did have back in the day, though full deglobalization perhaps means full onshoring. So some countries out of necessity may still need to maintain adequate exposure to China's growth. Some out of geostrategic necessity may choose not to. Some may try to have their cake and eat it, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So I think all of that put together means it's not a homogenous region, and economic structures are not homogenous either. So I think to each his own. Right now, will there be greater cooperation? Will the RCEP find traction? Will there be cooperation or some? Can we construct a Venn diagram between the RCEP and TPP? I think that will happen. But right now, I'm not seeing any cohesive moves towards setting up a regional bloc, and I don't think that's a priority for most governments either.
Yeah, and also we haven't discussed ASEAN, but that would also come into that. And how successful has ASEAN actually been in terms of complete regional integration? In some areas, okay, but in the fundamental areas, not quite so. Now we're going to move it a little bit to. And here's a kind of an IR question, and you won't be surprised it's going to come from somebody, one of the great scholars of international relations at the LSE, Barry Buzan, and he wants to ask the question, and I know, maybe George, you can have a go at this first. It's termed Cold War, constantly used, or New Cold War, or Cold War 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know which one. And given what's been happening in the US-China relationship, given what's been happening in Hong Kong, and of course the still unresolved issue of China-Taiwan Straits question, it's not going to go away anytime soon, is it? Given Trump in the White House, and given that when Trump is followed by Joe Biden, if he is followed by Joe Biden in November, Biden might be just as equally tough on China economically, at least, as Trump himself. Who knows? So therefore, do you think it's a term that you would feel happy using, or do you feel there's a real problem in using terms like Cold War? And that's Barry Buzan's question. George, why don't you have a go at that easy question?
Well, humbly, in the face of the questioner, yeah, I mean, Cold War obviously is suggestive of, you know, everything that we immediately think of as the Soviet Union, where there was precious little, if any, economic interdependence, and it was land armies facing each other, and all the things that we remember that of, and then so little of that actually seems to be pertinent in this particular relationship between China and the United States, or China and the West. So you know, I know it rolls off the tongue very easily, but I'm a bit hesitant about using it as a term, because I don't think that either in Washington or in Beijing, despite the feisty rhetoric about decoupling and self-reliance and so on, I don't get the feeling yet that there's a kind of a consensus to throw interdependence out of the window altogether. And I think that if the United States administration did change after November, that, yeah, I mean, it may not make much difference to the cross-party consensus about we need to engage with China in a different way from that which is obtained for the last 30 years. But I just think the approach could differ. Stylistically, it could change. And I think it's true to say that even though, you know, there is a lot of talk of decoupling on the one side and self-reliance on the other, opposite sides of the same coin, there are also people, you know, in in thinking circles, shall we say, in Washington and Beijing, that actually do think that there is mileage in interdependence, even if it's, as I said, different from the way that engagement is conducted is different from the way that it used to be. I have to say, at the moment, I think there is probably little political advantage, certainly in the United States, for anybody to get up on a platform and say, we think engagement is a good idea. I mean, it just is not going to carry very much weight with voters. But the reality is, I think that I certainly wouldn't want to rule it out. You know, it's quite possible for relations between the United States and China to deteriorate much further to the point where it becomes much frostier than it is today. But I don't think it's out of the realms of possibility either that the economic interdependence, which companies basically want to preserve, you know, will survive in some form. And I think that's a reasonable platform for thinking about some sort of modus vivendi, even though it's different.
But I had a very interesting debate on Saturday, George, just to give you background, with my good colleague here at the LSE, another great figure in international relations, Professor Coker. And I kind of took more your line, and I think Christopher, you know, brilliantly, as always, took his own view on this. And I think he kind of took the view, and I'm not putting words into his mouth, I hope, that we are facing a tipping point has happened. We've turned a corner, and that the consensus growing in the United States isn't just of China as maybe quite a lot of interdependence, but China as a revisionist power. China is a challenge to the liberal world order. China challenges basic US values, and that therefore something much more serious is going on. Even though there's going to remain some degree of interdependence, it's that seriousness, worst case analysis, if you like, that we have to take into consideration. But maybe the jury's out on this, I think.
Can I say, I mean, just very quickly to that comment, I mean, I think that's absolutely correct, but the intent which we might read into what's coming from China's leadership does not necessarily mean that we are either correctly evaluating it or that it's likely to be successful. So I think it throws a huge onus on the people that are supposed to think out, American or Western policy towards China to properly assess this. I mean, I don't disagree with what your professor friend said, but I just think it's we can overread it as well.
Okay. Joe, you want to come in? Or Geoffrey, even, are you allowed as an economist to talk about things like Cold War? I certainly would hope. Does it make any sense from an economic point of view? Let me ask Geoffrey first. What do you think? Is it, sorry,
Well, I think, again, overall right now, the policy debate in China for the economic model, right, that has been thrown off course. I just go back to the question you asked me earlier. So can China afford an can China afford to be an autarky? And guess what the best example of an autarky is? Oddly enough, it's actually the United States, right? Yeah. So, well, if you don't count North Korea, right? So right along the border, but we'll just leave that from one side. The United States, actually, if you measure, trade over GDP, if you measure the share of domestic consumption over GDP, that actually is why the US is quite insulated, from global gyrations, right? So, oddly enough, if that's the model China wants to pursue, become quote unquote economically self-sufficient, then actually pushing for decoupling is in China's interests, right? But they just can't realize that yet. But is that path actually consistent with a rising middle class, and they want access to global goods, and they want access to global travel, which is going to be very important as well. So I think that's a debate needs to be had. It's not a simple measure of, okay, so what's the role of the state and how will that measure up in international relations, and will that feed into the space where it's going to challenge global norms and the like. It's much more fundamental than that, right? So what do the people actually want? Do you actually want to ask the people in terms of what this model is right or wrong? So I don't think the people or consumers, be it middle class or low middle class, or the rising agrarian, the shrinking actually agrarian of a population as they are gradually urbanized, I don't think they know that yet either. I don't think the US figured it out. It's still figuring itself out, right? The UK right now is trying to figure itself how much of a state input, would actually want. So is it a Scandinavian model, or is it something more Friedmanite, right? So that conversation about the economic structure needs to go hand in hand with the geopolitical conversation right now, because then you may actually find, as mentioned earlier, some things that you think are going against your interests right now are in your interest. Is that debate happening within the policy circles in China right now? I'll probably defer that to Cherry.
Yeah, I love your example of the United States as a good example of self-sufficiency and autarky. In fact, the United States grew up economically throughout the 19th century and for half of the 20th century behind protective barriers.
Yep.
Trade, in some sense, is historically novel when you come to the United States and coincides with the post-war period. And Trump has actually argued, quite interestingly, that protectionism, and not autarky, but protectionism is very Republican. Hamilton, after all, you go through Lincoln. Anyway, but it's an interesting question about the role of the United States and the degree to which it has degrees of autonomy, given also its size, from the world economy, which means that it can get away with quite a lot of things that other countries simply can't, including, by the way, China. I've got another question. If you want to come in on that, Cherry, please feel free to do so. I just want to throw another question from a colleague at LSE, Kent Dang, on the whole question of has trust ever existed between China and the West? And more importantly, has trust between both sides declined precipitately over the last 2 to 3 years? The degree to which one needs trust in order to build both stable economic as well as stable political relationship. And of course, we all know there's a big literature on trust in international relations. And it does have material consequences, of course. If you don't trust the other side to do the right thing or to look after contracts, you will have a real problem with that. Cherry, do you want to come in on that one and add anything else you want to say on that one?
Sure.
George,
sure. Yeah. Just on that question on trust. I mean, I think the West perhaps always have this illusion somehow one day China would become like one of them. China will become like a liberal democracy, but obviously China decided to charter its own way. So of course there is a huge disappointment from the Western community in general. Now, if we're talking about that trust, I think we cannot really separate that trust and also for that sense of economic benefits that certain Western companies has been taken from China in the first phase of the market opening and economic reform. So I wouldn't say it's the trust. I think it's rather is the economic necessity and somehow put two camps together back to 80s and 90s and then up to the age when China joined WTO. So it's about economic necessity rather than trust between the two sides. I mean, simply the two political systems are just not compatible. That's my view. And secondly, the question on whether new Cold War or no new Cold War, I think that I'll refrain to mention that word. But I agree with Geoffrey, given the example of the United States, another very odd example I can give by talking about actually decoupling is not happen, is if we think about just recent phase 1 trade deal between China and the United States, just consider the large quantity that agricultural products that China will have to promise to purchase from the United States. That is actually recoupling to link two countries getting much closer rather than to divide two countries. And then Trump has attacked China by saying China does not respect the market rule. And then actually by asking China to purchasing that many agricultural products is actually Donald Trump distort the market rule by himself. So a lot of ironies within this accusation. I mean, I'm not saying China is innocent or whatever. I'm just saying, yes, perhaps American can imagine a kind of world system and it itself would continue to enjoy that hegemonic status. I mean, Mick, you wrote extensively about this, hegemonic status. And then perhaps that's what America would like to retain, that hegemonic status. Now, the differences between the Cold War and what we're facing now between China and the United States, the Cold War is really based on that extensive arms race between the two powers, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And economically, United States, Soviet Union are not closely intertwined at all as what China and the United States has been doing in the last 40 years. So we're talking about Cold War. Actually, this perhaps will also do a lot of harm to the United States as well. Not just China, not just harming China, but also harming the United States.
Yeah, well, the very specific issue, of course, of Chinese students who study in the United States. We've already seen a real problem in the relationship between Australia and China concerning the whole question of Chinese students. It could even impact on the UK. It might do that anyway without any of the rhetoric, but that's certainly an aspect of that, isn't it, as well? I'm going to bring in, I've got other questions. We've got 5 minutes to go. Well, somebody asked the question, does China have a vision? It's a very general one, and it also links to a question by one of my students on the Executive Masters, Verena Bau, a good friend from Germany, who said, when you talk about a shared future, I think you mentioned the term shared future, should we any longer talk of, in such grandiloquent terms, of a shared future between China and the rest of the world? Because it does go back to, I suppose, the fundamentals of the question. And what about this China dream? Is that still alive, or that vision? Is that still there? George, do you want to come in on the China dream, the vision?
Yeah, and I think it kind of links in with the trust question as well, because I think whilst we could certainly say that however we chose to define trust relations before 2012, they changed afterwards. Because one of the first speeches that Xi Jinping made as party leader once he came to power was about the long-term struggle between socialism and capitalism, which, of course, he opined that, that China would become preeminent and would win that struggle, that it would be a long-term struggle, that it would have to be prepared for different phases, etc., etc. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous just to kind of look at the last 40 years as though it's a continuum. It's not a continuum, in my view. Something changed in 2012, and obviously the American political situation itself changed in 2016 as well. But when you talk about vision and the China, the dream about the great Chinese rejuvenation and the common destiny or shared future and all of this lovely kind of flowery rhetoric, is very much something which I think we should take very seriously. It is something, an image which I think Xi Jinping is trying to create about China's future, and it does sit rather uncomfortably, I think, in this idea about it's just kind of a hiccup that if only we could kind of sort it out. And it's not, and of course the economic interdependence, which we've spoken about throughout this afternoon, is really, really important and very precious in this context, because it is something that binds us all together. And you have to be, you really have to sort of go quite a long way to try to sever this and break it up. But yeah, I mean, I do think that there is a vision. I do think that it's different when a Leninist state basically articulates a vision in which it wants to kind of drive the shape of the future. I mean, I'm sure the United States always has wanted and still wants the world to be like it in a way, but I don't think it has the same sort of sanctioning agenda and all the things that we associate now with China to do that. So it does have a vision. I don't think it's one that we really share, but I'm not saying at all that means that we have to, go to war.
No. Well, I certainly hope not. We've got 2 minutes left, Cherry and Geoffrey. Any final comments and anything you want to pick up on the question of vision, dream, maybe the BRI? You've talked about that at great length, I know, Cherry.
Well, less so about BRI, just on this whole ideas of China dream. I mean, what are we talking about in here is we're only talking about in a matter of 70 years' time. I mean, we can't imagine this is a country that actually come to the center for international stage back to 40 years ago. And the Chinese people somehow felt they have never had it best compared with where we are now. They have never been so prosperous. So perhaps they are legitimately to be proud of themselves to a large extent. So this whole ideas of China dream, I think this would widely apply for not just the current generation of Chinese leaders, but what I found more and more interestingly is how many Chinese young people do sincerely believe this China dream. And they felt somehow the future is in their hand and they can actually achieve quite a lot. And especially after this COVID-19. And what I felt the Chinese youngsters seem to take far more different views for liberal democracy compared with the past. So perhaps now is really just a bellwether on what is about to come.
That's a very interesting comment. Geoffrey, any final thoughts on these issues and anything else?
Well, actually, just to follow up on that, one thing I'd call upon everyone is, just to try to understand, the other side a bit more, and this applies as much over to those coming to the West, from China, and those going the other way. What I've noticed over the last 10, 15 years here is that there's a new generation of Chinese executives. I think that's the best way to describe them. They are camped out here in London right now. I've been told there are 3 red flags fluttering around the Bank of England building. The Bank of England's gold vault is attached to the Bank of China's gold vault next door, right? So, but they are here to still, learn, especially about, financial markets, about regulation in particular. The People's Bank of China has never, ever hid its admiration actually for the regulatory framework in the United Kingdom, how the Bank of England, oversees the Financial Conduct Authority, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, for example, they've outright said, that is a model, though Sweden said that as well. So there still is a lot of knowledge actually for the West to partake, be it on a technocratic level without going into values and stuff that's controversial, where at the other side, maybe just by default, just as a natural reaction, almost reflexively, they actually don't want to hear about that. So, but it's in these technical exchanges, where some more understanding, can actually be garnered, and there's still, hope for that. And again, this is a generation that's actually been brought up in prosperity. They have their own views about a wide array of things, and many of them educated in the West as well. So don't underestimate that power as well. And it's heartening to hear there's still that in general the moves towards so the restrictions on Chinese students in the United Kingdom. I think that's more COVID travel related, so health issues more than anything else, and long may that continue, right? But net, I'd always like to end on an optimistic note, right? And everyone can have his or her own dream, right? And nothing's so they don't need to come into conflict, right? But understanding each other's dreams, I think that's far more important.
Well, on that optimistic note, and which of course I'm bound to share, and the LSE has made its own contribution to this understanding over many, many years. We have a long and, I think, good relationship with China, which goes back a long way, particularly through our summer school, Cherry, but many, many other things. Great anthropologists who studied here in the 30s. Xu Enlai sent many of his up-and-coming young, bright people in the 1970s to the LSE. And we have well over 1,000 students from the PRC, and let's hope they return next year, COVID or no COVID, and certainly that relationship remains. Thousands of students from China would not come to the United Kingdom unless they thought they were getting something out, and not just lectures on what the problems are of China. On that particular note, I'd like to say thank you to Cherry, Yu Jie, my friend, young friend, George Magnus. George, wonderful again to see you, and to Geoffrey Yu. Thank you again for making your contributions. Thank you to all the people out there who've asked questions. There's lots of other questions out there. I wasn't trying to censor anybody. We had 1,000 flowers bloom. That's always been my line, but I couldn't get everybody in the time. I'd also like to thank the team at Ideas for everything they've done to make this possible, including Dave Sutton and many others like Jess Keating. Thank you very much indeed. I think there's a form that you can fill in online if you would like to. Feedback is always important from our point of view to try and improve what we do in LSE Ideas. So with no further ado, I'd like to bid you all good afternoon or good evening or good morning, wherever you are around the world. And once again, welcome and farewell. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.